How would you feel if you discovered that the 30% markup you're putting on your materials, the markup everyone told you was the standard, is actually costing you thousands in profit every year? See, most electricians are undercharging for materials without even realizing it, because the way we're taught to price our wire, boxes, and devices misses all the invisible costs that show up long after the invoice is paid. And if you weren't compensating for these invisible costs on your material pricing, you're not just losing pennies, you're missing out on profit that you could use to grow your business or hire more people. In this video, I'm going to show you the 3 invisible costs that are eating your profit before you even get to the job. Why the markup versus margin misconception leaves most tradesmen with far less profit than they think, and the tool the pros use to automatically price everything from a 5-cent wire nut to a $1,000 EV charger, so that you're always profitable but you're never overpriced. See, to understand what's happening to the materials in the back of your van, we need to talk about the Ice King. Back in the mid 1800s, Frederic Tudor, who people called the Ice King, built an empire shipping massive blocks of ice from New England to the Caribbean. This is a true story. On paper, the business looked like a gold mine. He got ice for free from frozen ponds, and then he sold it at a premium in the heat of the tropics. He prices ice based on what he cut out of the pond, but he didn't account for the fact that the ice was a fragile material and that it literally disappears while it's sitting in the ship. But Tudor almost went to prison several times for bankruptcy because he missed the hidden cost of the shrinkage. See, between melting in transit, the sawdust needed for insulation, and the blocks that shattered during loading, he was losing nearly 40% of his inventory before it even reached the customer. And see, it wasn't until he adjusted his pricing to account for the shrinkage that he actually became a millionaire. As electricians, we're like the modern day Ice King. We price our materials at what we buy them from at the supplier, but we ignore the shrinkage that's happening in our vans. So let's look at the costs that are making your materials less profitable than you think. First, we have the hidden sales tax error. Now, this varies depending on where you're at in North America, but let's look at my numbers for example. I have to pay a 12% sales tax on every piece of material that I buy. But when I send out the invoice, I'm only allowed to charge a 5% sales tax on my services, which includes the materials. So that means I'm already losing 7% on my materials the second I walk out of the supplier. My 30% markup secretly became 23%. Now, your local tax laws may vary, but the principle of unrecoverable sales tax is universal. Next up is what I call van shrinkage. See, electrical materials are actually pretty delicate. You just get a couple scratches in a 15-amp receptacle, and now the whole thing is garbage. And this applies to everything on your shelves. GFIs, switches, dimmers, wafer lights, pot light trims, you name it. Most electrical materials have a shelf life once they hit our vans, and the longer they sit there wiggling around while you're driving, the more wear and tear they get. You leave a few devices sitting on a shelf for a month or two, and the next thing you know, you're throwing out $30 GFIs. And at a 30% markup, if you scratch one $30 device, you have to sell 6 or 7 more just to replace the one that you tossed out. According to the National Electrical Contractors Association, NECA, and other various construction management studies, material waste and shrinkage for service vans are estimated at a 20 to 30% of the inventory value per year. So now you see the leaks. You're losing 7% or whatever on tax, and your van is literally eating your GFIs and lights. But here's the scary part. Most guys think they're fixing all of this just by marking everything up 30%. In reality, that safe number might be the biggest mistake you're making. Coming up next, I'm gonna show you the math trap that proves 30% isn't actually 30% and why it's keeping you broke. So we've identified the leaks, but now we need to talk about why the flat rate 30% method that most guys use is actually a huge mistake. The first issue is the fixed markup problem. If you're selling products that all cost roughly the same, a flat 30% might work okay. But in electrical, our material price points are all over the map. Take a standard receptacle or switch, for example. Those cost you maybe, what, 80 cents to $1? If you mark those up 30%, you're making a grand total of 24 cents on that sale. And that's nowhere near enough to even cover the risk of selling the devices. And like we talked about with van shrinkage, if you scratch this one outlet, you've got to sell 6 more just to replace the one you threw out. You can see that without even realizing it, you've put yourself on a hamster wheel of just selling materials to replace the ones you throw out with no real profit to be seen. And then there's the markup versus margin misconception. And this is the one that really trips people up. You've probably heard before that a 30% gross profit margin is the absolute baseline for a business to be considered healthy by a bank or an investor. But most tradesmen don't actually know the difference between margin and markup. So let's define them. Markup is the amount added to the cost price of goods to cover the overhead and profit. Margin is the difference between revenue and costs. Electricians often mark up their materials by 30% and think that they've hit the 30% profit margin. But in reality, a 30% markup only gives you a 23% margin, which is under baseline. To actually land at a 30% gross profit margin, and that's before we even account for the damage and shrinkage that we talked about in the van, you have to mark up your materials by at least 43%. So if you've been sticking to 30%, you're leaving 7% of your revenue on the table at every single job. We can prove this by using the discount test. See, if you mark up a $100 item by 30%, you sell it for $130, right? Feels good. But if a customer asks for a 25% discount and you say yes, guess what? You just lost money, because $130 minus 25% is $97.50. You sold it less than you bought it for. See, that is the danger of confusing markup and margin. The percentages don't move at the same speed. A 25% margin requires a 33% markup. A 50% margin requires a 100% markup. If you don't know this math, you're accidentally giving away your profit every time you negotiate a deal. If you've been using the flat 30% markup, you've essentially been giving away 7% of your revenue for free on every single job. But the problem goes even deeper than just the percentage. How are you supposed to stay competitive on a $1,000 EV charger while still making profit on an 80-cent wire nut? Well, to do that, I'm going to show you the sliding solution that allows you to be profitable on the small stuff and still competitive on the big price items, all at the same time. And hands down, the biggest problem with the way we've been marking up materials is that we're treating an 80-cent receptacle the same way we're treating a $1,000 EV charger. Now, to stop the bleeding, we use a tool called a markup table. A markup table is a software tool that evaluates your material pricing and applies a different markup based on specific price points. Instead of one flat percentage, you create a sliding scale. So for example, anything that costs between $0 and $5, like those receptacles and wire nuts, we can set a much higher markup percentage. And this ensures that we actually make a profit on the small stuff, but gives us a buffer to offset the van shrinkage and damage that we talked about earlier. Then for materials between $5 and say $20, we set a different markup rate, and so on and so forth. And the beauty of this system is that it keeps you profitable on the high risk cheap items, but keeps you competitive on the big ticket items like electrical panels and EV chargers, where you aren't worried about shrinkage or losing parts in the garbage or wherever. And this is how restaurants price their menus. They might only mark up the burger by 30% because they need to stay competitive with the restaurant next door. But that Coke or fries, they mark that up 300 or 400%. Why? Because they know you're not going to complain about a $4 Coke. As electricians, we need to price our wire nuts like they're fries and Coke with high markup. So we can price our panels like a restaurant prices burgers with a competitive markup. And here's what this looks like in Pricebook Pro, which is flat rate software for electricians. If we go into the settings tab here, you can see there's a material markup table. And we've set that anything between 1 cent and $5 has a 600% markup. Then from $5.01 to $20, we have a 350% markup, and so on and so forth up until $500 plus. As you can see, you just plug in your pricing tiers and the system does the math for you. It removes the guesswork and protects your margins and ensures that every time a journeyman grabs a part off the van, the business is actually making money. Once you stop treating every part like it's the same, your profits start to look very different. So if you want to use that markup tool that I mentioned, just click the link below to get it for free. Now, having the right pricing is one thing, but if you're still managing that price book on a spreadsheet or a piece of paper, you're building a mess that you don't even know exists yet. And to really grow, you need a backbone for your business that handles your quotes and your data without the headaches. So click right here to watch my video on the best software for electricians in 2025, where I break down the top tools to run your operation while you can stay focused on the work.